for joining this morning. I know it's quite an early time to join a video call, especially ahead of probably a ton of other video calls today, so thank you. 5Things is a morning meetup where 3 speakers share 5 key takeaways from one of their favourite non-fiction books. So I hope you'll leave this hour either a bit smarter, inspired to pick up the books, one of the books we talk about today, or maybe just feeling a bit better about stuff, which would be lovely too. A few bits of housekeeping. The event is being recorded, though you shouldn't, I don't think you'll appear unless you contribute. And please stay muted whilst the speakers are talking, that'd be great. I do encourage you to ask questions as we go along. Hopefully we'll have 20 minutes at the end just to chat through some of the things that we talk about today. I do have to remind you that the speakers, they're not experts in the domain. They're kindly sharing, their key takeaways from the books. So yeah, or unless you proclaim otherwise, Antoinette, Nathan, or Lawrence, that actually I have chosen something I have expertise in. But anyway, Sal, would you mind moving the slides on there? So yeah, just last time on 5Things, we had Josie, Dennis, and Katie share their 5 things about on Breathe, We Are the Weather and the Architecture of Happiness. And those videos are available to watch on the 5Things without the I, Twitter account and Instagram account. So this is the 13th 5 things, if you just pop it on one slide there, Sal. And we've managed to get through a lot of books, 39 books to be precise. That's 195 things. So I'll have to collate all those things one day. I think that'd be a nice thing to look at. And we've had some wonderful speakers along the way. Just on the next slide, Sal. And as always, I'm delighted to add 3 brand new speakers. Well, actually 2 brand new speakers, 1 returning speaker to this distinguished group. So we will say hey to Lauren, Nathan, and Antoinette. Hi, Lauren, Nathan, and Antoinette. So to kick us off today, we have Lauren. So Lauren is a senior UX researcher at Agent and one of my wonderful colleagues. She's currently kicking back on maternity leave. Is that right, Lauren?
Yeah, that's exactly it.
Yeah, I thought so. Today, she's kindly going to share her 5 key takeaways from How to Avoid Climate Disaster by Bill Gates. Thanks, Lauren.
Thank you. Good morning. Yeah, as Andy said, I am 100% in no way an expert on climate change, but the book was super interesting and kind of seemed fitting with the G7 summit this week. So, yeah, so it kind of, the book does what it says on the tin. It's just kind of laying out a strategy as Bill Gates sees it of how to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. But what I quite liked about it was you hear so many depressing things about climate change all the time, all the statistics. And I think it can feel a bit hopeless, like there isn't really a solution to it and that actually we can do nothing. And this just felt quite positive, and it felt like it was quite solvable. They'd be really tricky and that it's really kind of pressing, but that actually that we can do something about it. So that was quite nice. So we just jump into the first thing. Sorry, yeah, so it's very does what it says on the tin. It's just a strategy. Yeah, so the first thing that I took out of it was that reducing emissions actually isn't enough, and we need to get to net zero. So obviously a lot of the targets that we hear about like halving or taking the emissions back by a big percentage, but actually argues that if we do that, we'll still get to the tipping point. And he uses a really nice bathtub analogy where if a bath's filling with water, that it's still going to overflow at some point if you just turn the tap down. So actually what you need to do is turn the tap off entirely and let some of the water out that's already there. And we do have a few kind of like techniques that you can use to take some of the carbon out of the atmosphere, but that ultimately we need to be turning the tap off so that it kind of stops adding more carbon to the atmosphere, and hopefully we will not reach the tipping point. And that we actually need to do that by 2050, and that it's quite pressing. And I kind of thought, well, if we've got to take it back, then hopefully our cutting back on our emissions are going to it's like a good stepping stone to getting there. But actually what he argues is that you'd be doing very different things if you were cutting down your emissions as to getting to net zero altogether. And he uses the example of gas power stations. So that's something that they're talking about kind of implementing because it emits less carbon. But actually, I think he was saying to make gas power stations cost effective, they've got to be used for years and years and years. So actually, in the long run, it will still be emitting an awful lot of carbon versus if you were using renewables sooner and might need to top it up with fossil fuels for the moment. So actually we need to set the goal correctly in the first place rather than having lots of stepping stones that might take away from the ultimate goal. And that kind of takes us on to the second point, that actually it's unrealistic to think that we're going to be able to massively reduce the power that the world uses at the moment. So going for clean power over no power, it's completely unrealistic to stop the demand for fuel. It would change our entire way of life that we live in at the moment. And it's also unrealistic for developing countries to not start using more fuel as well. Obviously, as it becomes more available readily, then people are going to want to use it, and that's kind of fair, and it'd be immoral to stop countries from needing more as well. So what he argues is that we need to replace fossil fuels with renewables and electrify everything, and use this clean fuel to power the electricity by having a bit of a portfolio of renewable fuels available. Obviously, that's a massive overhaul of the system that we use at the moment, and we're taking in a huge amount of like investment and research and development and general public engagement, everything. Like, it's a massive undertaking. But he argues that's the only way that we can possibly do it. There's already a bit of a move towards it across the world, I think, with lots of cities making like their vehicle fleet electric and a big push towards air source heat pumps. But that's kind of the way that we need to be going. He does make a bit of a side point. Obviously, Bill Gates's background is in, apart from Microsoft, is in global health. And that's where his kind of social side is focused. And he argues that actually developing countries need to be still focusing on global health, and that this is very much a developed country, I guess, problem in the first place, and that they have a little bit more time to catch up, and that's where they should be spending their funds at the moment on global health problems. So that also leads into the next problem or point. And this was a big one for me. He argues that we need a massive PR campaign for nuclear power. I had a lot of reservations about nuclear, I think, similar to a lot of people. But one of the big problems with renewable energy, obviously, is intermittency. If you're using wind, then you need wind. If you're using solar, you need the sun. And at the periods of time that you don't have those resources available to you, then obviously you can't be producing energy, and it's also incredibly difficult to store the amounts of energy that we need to use later on. And the only current renewable that we have available that doesn't have issues of intermittency is nuclear. And obviously, because of such a time pressure, we need to work with what we've got available. And he argues that that's going to be one of the key contenders in helping to solve the problem. And he talks a lot about cars, and how when cars became available, we didn't stop using them because they were dangerous, but we made them safer. And that actually we have a lot of the technology available to us to make nuclear safer, but because of the horrible big disasters that we've had, that people are understandably really reluctant and hesitant to use nuclear. But actually his argument is that's where the potential is currently, as well as investing in new technologies and developing other areas. He says that, I thought it was quite an interesting fact, that air pollution kills more people each year than nuclear has ever done, with the disasters that we've had. So yeah, a huge campaign for nuclear, he argues, is needed. And leading on to my next thing, although we can replace the fuel that we have with clean fuel, we still need to overhaul every way that we live life at the moment, and there's going to make there's a lot of changes that are needed. And there's 5 key areas that we would need to do that, he argues. Renewables, as we chatted about. Sorry, this book is very overview, so there's a lot that he goes through very quickly. There isn't time in this talk, or really in the book, to go massively into details. He just alludes to different areas in these 5 things that would need to change. Renewables, manufacturing, the way that we produce our goods, how we grow food and what we eat. So that comes down to fertilizer and using different types of fertilizer, less fertilizers, and eating less meat and dairy, travel. And a big one for me I didn't know about was how we heat and cool our homes. Knew it was a thing, but maybe not quite such a contender as it is, and we need different ways of doing that. Again, it was about 2 months ago that I read this book, and there were lots of details on heating and cooling, but they have gone from my mind entirely. But yeah, that was important. And also that at the moment carbon is extremely cheap, and we can use a lot of carbon very, very cheaply. He argues it ends up per litre being cheaper than Coca-Cola in a lot of countries. But actually there needs to be a carbon tax so that we're paying the real cost for carbon that we use. And that at the moment there's a big green premium, and it makes green solutions not very attractive or doable for most countries. And the green premium is the difference in price between the polluting fuel and the green solutions. So if we do have this carbon tax, that'll help reduce that, as well as research and development and investment in these areas. Yeah, and if we're kind of creating more green solutions, then people are going to invest in them, and that kind of gradually helps bring them closer together. And the last point is just that we need to talk about it, like everyone, all the time. It's not enough to be using our reusable coffee cups and taking our tote bags to Tesco. That actually as individuals, we do have quite a lot of power, but that it goes kind of above and beyond our individual lifestyle choices, that we need to be putting pressure on the people that can make the change. So emailing supermarkets and MPs that what we really need is research and development and policy changes, and that actually they're not going to happen unless individually we all start kind of putting pressure on. And back to that, the power of the pound. And it's not just the kind of like the small tiny difference that our purchases make, but actually showing that there's a need and a demand in different green solutions, and when it's seen that there's demand, then that's where the investment comes from, and that'll kind of be the springboard. And that actually our personal consumption is such a tiny element of it, but that if you are making changes, that you can choose those changes widely, and that some things like metal straws are probably going to be a very tiny thing compared to other areas in your life that you can change, such as a more drastic one like becoming vegan, or lots of different changes. And as a sideline, I read a really interesting book recently called How Bad a Banana Is, that kind of helps you make informed decisions on which areas you could change. And turns out bananas are actually really good, and they're not that bad at all. But I would recommend that if anybody is interested. So that was a really quick whistle-stop tour. I can't say you've read the book after listening to me for 5 minutes whistling on, but I would highly recommend reading it as well if you get a chance. It was really kind of quite reassuring in a way, as well as scary. So yeah, reducing emissions isn't enough. We need to be reducing it to zero, creating clean power over no power. That we need to have a look at nuclear to address intermittency, changing everything and overhaul, and pressing the policymakers to make these changes, and we need to talk about it.
Thanks so much, Lauren. That's awesome. We've got a round of applause for Lauren. Crowd go wild. Well, I've got a ton of questions on that, which I'll save for the end. That was super interesting. Thanks so much for covering that, Lauren. And we'll move swiftly on to Nathan. And Nathan is founder and director of Create Future, as you can see from the backdrop. There it is. I've worked with Nathan. I've been lucky enough to work with Nathan a couple of times and can attest to his prowess at synthesizing those messy, complex problems into the elegant little bundles of sense. Is that fair to say? Yeah,
you got lucky.
So the expectations are super high here. But Nathan's kindly going to share and get real about the 100-year life by Lynda, Gratton and Andrew Scott. Nathan.
Great. Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Andy. Thanks, Lauren. Yeah, that book's definitely on my wish list, so I'm going to move it up the pile. So yeah, The 100-Year Life by Lynda, Gratton, Andrew Scott. They are an economist and a psychologist. So the book covers sort of the money and the mindset implications of living a longer life. I bought this book thinking it would be useful, and it has been, in my work with a Create Future with pension clients, of which we have a few, and it really has. But I never, when I picked it up and started reading it, I never really expected the effect it would have on me personally. And in the space of a couple of years, my life is pretty drastically different as a result, which is quite a surprise. But I'll get to that. I'll take you through the book first. So the book is about the changes, personal and societal, that are going to be needed to make the most of the extraordinary gains in life expectancy that have occurred very quickly around the world in the last 100 years. The book's received multiple awards. It's been translated into 15 languages. It was the #1 selling book in Japan. There's even a manga version of it, if that's your thing. It's part of the curriculum at the London Business School. It's been debated at the World Economic Forum in Davos and discussed by world leaders at the G20 summit. So I tell you that because while I'm going to paraphrase it horribly in this presentation, you can be assured that the data is there and the observations and predictions in it stand up to scrutiny. It's going to be a whistle-stop tour. So the whole book is predicated around the fact that we will live longer, and we are living longer. On average, we are living longer than our parents, longer still than our grandparents. Our children, if you're lucky enough to have them, and our children's children will live longer than us. I think life expectancy is going up at a rate of 2 years per decade. A child born in the West today has a more than 50% chance of living to be 105. 100 years ago, that chance would have been 1 in 100. So at 47, I'm predicted to live to about 83. And if you're interested, I'll post a link to a tool to the Office of National Statistics at the end, and you can check your estimated lifespan. So conventionally, living longer is seen as being older for longer, but there's evidence that this convention is reversing. And in fact, we're staying younger for longer. I'll get to changing attitudes and life stages later, but just medically, science can keep us alive longer. And while there's obviously an increased incidences of ill health currently and conditions like dementia, which nobody wants to live through and probably scares a lot of people about their advancing years, as this segment of the population grows, there's greater investment and advances in all areas of later life health. So in summary, we'll live longer and we should have a healthier later life period as a result. So this has caused problems. So the next stage. So I'm actually on slide 2 now. I forgot to move along. I'm looking at my presenter notes. There we go. Point 2. Yeah, the 3-stage life view is outdated. So those 3 stages are education in readiness for the 2nd stage, which is employment, and then retirement. So the problem is life expectancy has increased, but the retirement age has stayed largely the same. So this causes a significant problem. Like most people simply just can't afford a generous or even adequate pension if they live longer. So the options then are either to work longer or to make do with a lot less in later years. And neither of those are particularly attractive. The problem's not just with work, I'll talk more about work in a minute, but the problems are with each stage. So if you consider education, for example, in a relatively stable work environment, the knowledge and the skills that you learn in your late teens and your 20s could possibly last you, your whole career without any major retraining or major reinvestment. And that's the way it's typically been. You learn something, you apply that to your career, you retire. But we are no longer in a relatively stable work environment. It's changed massively even in the last 50 years, 100 years, and it's going to change more as robotics and artificial intelligence upend entire industries. So staying relevant and productive as you work into your 70s and possibly even your early 80s is going to require setting aside time to make fundamental investments in relearning and reskilling. Basically, the only way a 3-stage life as it currently exists can be made to work when more of us are living to 100 is with a very long 2nd stage of continuous employment. So this might make the finances balance, but it doesn't work for the other things that matter in life. And stretched over time, that amount of time, work just becomes too hard, too exhausting, and too boring. So there needs to be a change. So the next slide. Thank you. So, and that stage is to live a more flexible, more responsive, multi-stage life with multiple careers, with breaks and transitions. So the author asks you to imagine that you have 2 or 3 careers, one where you maximize your finances and you work longer hours and longer weeks, and at another stage in your life, you balance work with family or around jobs that make a strong social contribution, or a lower paid or lower effort, but more creatively or personally fulfilling to you. And it becomes much more normal to switch between these kind of, and easier for people to switch between these careers. So currently we only really transition twice, once from education into employment and then from employment into retirement. But a multi-stage life requires more transitions, more change. And personally and societally, we're not really well set up to navigate these changes. Being flexible, acquiring new knowledge, giving up positions of power that we've accumulated, letting go of old associates, building new networks. These transformative skills are difficult and require personal growth and support from institutions around us, which, employers, education, government, which just don't exist right now, but will have to emerge. Personally, we might see a change in our attitude to learning. We might see a shift from recreation to recreation, like with more hours in our life, there's more time for leisure. But we may also benefit from using some of that downtime to invest in recreating ourselves in preparation for our next transition. Next slide, please. So it's likely then we'll see new stages of life emerge. In fact, one already has. 18 to 30-year-olds are delaying major life decisions, living more flexible, less committed lives, marrying later, having children later, not closing down their options. And for my work with my clients, I've interviewed dozens of people in their 60s approaching retirement, and time again found a highly dynamic, positive, active group of people. They're getting divorced, they're dating, they're having sex, they're starting businesses. They are far from getting ready to settle into an armchair to see out their later years. So another thing that's likely to happen is in time, age will become decoupled with life stages. So currently, if I say graduate to you, you picture it as someone in the 20s, and the 3-stage life as it exists today has led to an institutional separation of the young, the middle-aged and the old. We don't mix a great deal in education or in workforces. This will change as different ages meet, and hopefully will change attitudes to each other, in a positive way. And even in the family, we'll commonly have 4 generations from a family living at the same time. So as life expectancy has grown at a faster rate at which women become mothers, we'll see more complicated family structures and hopefully changing generational attitudes, as a result. And then thing 5, the next slide. So finally, before I kind of get into the summary of the book, getting your finances is essential, but money is far from being the most important resource. Your family, your friendships, your health, your mental health, and your happiness are all crucial components to living well into later life. And in fact, if your finances are dependent on your career, you can't have a long and successful career if your skills, if your health, and if your relationships are depleted. Similarly, without solid finances, it's hard to invest in these crucial non-financial measures. So a balance of investment in finance and in your own quality of life is essential. So next slide. So I mentioned at the outset this book changed my life. Like, the context of when I read it is really important. I read it in the summer of 2019 as I was recovering from pneumonia. I was really ill, and I was quite scared at times, to be honest. And I was bedridden for about 3 weeks. I was off work for about 6 weeks. I lost a couple of stone. And at one point, I looked in the mirror. I felt like I'd aged 10 years, and I wanted to get better. And I'd read this book at the time. I wanted to get better, and I wanted to live a longer life. I wanted it to be a healthier, happier, secure one. And it made me realize there were things I needed to do now to ensure that happened. So the first thing I did was address my mental health. I'd had depression and anxiety for close to 10 years, for 8 years, particularly crippling panic attacks. So, I went on medication while I went through therapy and adopted mindfulness practices, which made a massive difference. I'm now in a much better place. I worked on my health, cut down alcohol, cut it out completely the first 6 months of this year. I have had a couple of pints in June. Improved my diet, started doing yoga every day. my attitude to work has changed. So I have more purpose and sense of what I'm doing here at Create Future, you know, in terms of investing my time and energy to grow this sustainably into something in a shorter time period, so it can potentially fund, you know, or sustain a second career in my 50s, you know, or late 60s. I don't want to do this forever, you know. So, and on that note, I've said yes to more mentoring opportunities so that I'm making more connections and learning from more businesses and business models. And you never know, one of those businesses that I work with or meet, you know, might be the one that I'm interested in transitioning to when I get bored of or tired of working at Create Future. But the most difficult thing was addressing issues in my relationship. As I said, the fundamental to get family and close relationships right if you're going to be happier over a longer life. And I was approaching my 10-year marriage anniversary, 16 years together. And while we were okay, there were fundamental issues we'd never really tackled that were going to hold us back from being happy into our 30s, 40, 50 years of marriage. And so as painful as it was, we brought those into the light. And after a lot of work, you know, we decided on good terms to separate. So it's sad and difficult, but done very much on the right reasons. And, you know, I've no doubt both of us will be happier in the long run. So the surprising outcome of thinking over the long term is that I'm much happier today. I nurture and enjoy my friendships because I want them to last into my old age. I invest in my interests, knowing that I'm going to have a ton of leisure time later in life, and it'd be good to get good at the things I enjoy. I'm even happier paying into my pension and my mortgage because I can appreciate its importance of its later importance in living a happier, more secure later life. So two very last points in closing. So the first is privilege. You know, I'm not struggling to make ends meet every month, so I can save and plan ahead. I'm able to afford coaching and therapy. I have the time and resources to exercise and retrain if I really needed to. But relatively few people today have these privileges. So yeah, we're all going to live longer. So one of the big challenges called out in the book is, you know, for society will be to ensure that the benefits of a longer life aren't just reserved for the better off. Actually, we're seeing a little dip in life expectancy in Western societies recently, but only in poorer demographics. And the second is that greater life expectancy is only a good thing if life itself is good. I turned 47 a couple of weeks ago, and instead of feeling old, I felt excited. You know, I'm only halfway through my adult life. So this book was important because, you know, it taught me to plan for tomorrow, but to live for today. And that's it from me.
Wow, thanks so much, Nathan. Massive round of applause. And I asked this question a while ago. You know, as a book truly changed my life, I've read quite a lot of books, and probably like the answer go, well, maybe not like sort of state as life changing. Definitely affected me, but that book is perhaps one that you put in your maybe small life-changing library. Is that fair to say?
It's a very easy book to read, and it's relatively short. It's £2.50 on Kindle.
And then it's £2.50. Go on, get it. Change your life for £2.50. Well, thanks so much for that. So things that I've been thinking about a lot recently as I will approach just I'm obviously younger, but I'm hitting 46 this year. So yeah, it's a very timely one for me as well. Okay, well, please, yeah, get some questions in the chat for Nathan, but we'll move swiftly on to Antoinette. So Antoinette is the founder and managing director of With Insight Coaching and Training, award-winning consultancy based in the UK with a client base that spans the globe. She's also a long-time friend of mine and one of the loveliest and smartest folks I know. So I'm bloody delighted she's here to share her 5 things. So Antoinette is going to share her insights from The Gift by Edith Eger. Antoinette.
Thanks, Andy. So I chose this book because I really like feisty women, and I'm always incredibly impressed and intrigued by anyone who can come through life's trauma and trials and tribulations and come through wiser and kinder and more loving. So it's like perfect, the perfect book after Nathan's, actually. And I don't think anyone demonstrates that better than Dr. Edith Eger. I was also drawn to this book because Edith is a contemporary of my mother. And my mother was born in Haguenau on the border of France and Germany in 1932. She was French and Catholic, and Edith was Hungarian and Jewish. But they were both very similar. They were both quite shy and unassuming women. And as adults, they were both haunted by some of the terror of growing up during, what can only have been the unimaginable horrors of the Second World War. So my mother was very lucky, and a bit like Nathan was just talking about, she managed to find sanctuary in a really calm and steady safety in her marriage. Some of us don't have that luxury, and Edith's way was through therapy and through finding these life lessons that enabled her to move through some of that trauma. So Edith was 16 in the spring of 1944. She was living with her parents in Kassa in Hungary. And one cold day in April in 1944, the Jews of Kassa were rounded up and imprisoned in an old factory at the edge of town, in an old brick factory. A few days later, they were loaded onto a cattle car bound for Auschwitz. And the gift, this book, really tells of her life story through the lens of her own life experiences and through her clients. And she identifies the 12 lessons that enabled her to liberate herself from some of the trauma and the grief and the horror of those 12 months that she spent in the death camps. So the most important thing about this book is, as it says, it's about strength, hope, and freedom. And it offers us all three a reminder of our agency and our power to overcome. So lesson 1. There's no Prozac in Auschwitz, the prisoner avoidance. So when Edith was in Auschwitz, she had no way of numbing out or taking the edge off the full terror of the cruelty she experienced at the hands of the capo who ran the death camps. She lived in the constant fear that she and her beloved sister could and would be murdered at any moment. And there was no real avoiding the brutal reality of her situation. She writes, our only option was to learn to be good observers of ourselves and our circumstances. We had to learn to just be. There was no crying in the camps. The feelings would come later. And for many, many years, she managed to avoid them and to keep running away. Then when Edith's daughter Marianne was 5, she came home from school crying because she hadn't been invited to a birthday party. And Edith confesses that at that time, she didn't know how to let Marianne have her feelings or even how to be present with her own feelings. Edith's denial of her repressed trauma in Auschwitz left her incapable of guiding Marianne through her sadness and her disappointment. And her remedy, same with my mum, for every upset was to eat something sweet. So she led Marianne to the kitchen, gave her a chocolate milkshake and a big slice of Hungarian 7-layer chocolate cake. Subsequently, Edith started to do her own work on her own repressed feelings. She learned that we disable our children when we take away their suffering. We teach them that feelings are wrong or scary. She writes, it's better to allow their feelings and to keep them company. A feeling is just a feeling. It's not an identity. There are many good reasons why we avoid our feelings. They're uncomfortable, or they're not the feelings we think we should be having, or we're afraid of what they could mean, or what they might reveal about the choices we've made, or the choices we're about to make. As long as we're avoiding our feelings, we are denying reality. She encourages us to invite our feelings in, to sit with them and to keep them company. Then you can decide how long you are going to hold on to them. You are not a fragile little somebody, she writes. You can face every reality. And the 2 key points that I took away, the 2 kind of messages were, you can't heal it if you can't feel it, and everything is temporary. So lesson 2, all relationships will end, the prison of self-neglect. So one of our first fears is of abandonment. We learn early on how to get what she calls the 3 A's, attention, affection, and approval. And we figure out what we need to do and whom we need to become in order to get those needs met. And the problem is not that we do those things, it's that we keep on doing them into adulthood. And we think that we must do those things in order to be loved. So it's very dangerous to put your life into somebody else's hands. You are the only one that you're going to have for a lifetime. All other relationships will end. So the question is, how can you be the most loving, no-nonsense caregiver to yourself? And the 3 takeaways from this lesson this chapter were, for me, everything we practice, we become better at. So savor those pleasant sensations, that first sip of coffee, the sound of the rain on the roof, and take time to notice and experience joy. She also recommends what she calls work, love and play. She says, make a chart that shows how much time you spend every day working, loving and playing. All three are all three roughly in balance? How could you structure your days differently so that you could have more of whatever is currently receiving the least of your time or attention? And then lastly, show yourself some more love. You know, what could you do today that would be a radical act of self-love? And I think that actually every act of self-love is pretty radical. Okay, lesson 3. Okay, are we ready for this one? Sorry for I always like to go for the jugular. Would you like to be married to you? The prison of resentment. The biggest disruptor of intimacy is low-level chronic anger and irritation. Edith resented her husband Bella for his impatience and his ill temper, and for all the ways he remained stuck in the past. Interesting how she was resenting Bella for stuff that she was also herself struggling with, I think. This resentment festered for so many years that she thought the only way to free herself was to divorce him. It was only after they split that she realized her disappointment and anger had little to do with Bella and everything to do with her. The real problem lay with her own unfinished emotional business and her unresolved grief. She explains that when we're angry, it's often because there is a gap between our expectations and reality. We think it's the other person trapping and aggravating us, but the real prison is our unrealistic expectations. We fall in love with love or with an image of a person to whom we've assigned all the traits and characteristics that we crave, or with someone with whom we can repeat the familiar patterns we learned in our families of origin. We present a false self, seeking love and a secure relationship, but at the same time giving up who we really are. Falling in love is a chemical high. It feels amazing, and it's temporary. When the feeling fades, we're left with a lost dream. And so many salvageable relationships are abandoned in despair. But love isn't what you feel, it's what you do. So she describes her client, Marina, a dancer and a performance artist who came to Edith to help her figure out if her marriage was salvageable. Now, Marina and her husband had apparently been fighting every single day for 18 years, and she was concerned about the impact that this was having on their teenage daughter. She didn't want to continue as things were, and she didn't see any way of making things better except for leaving. Edith tells her, every choice has a price, something you gain and something you lose. One choice we can always make is to do nothing, to decide not to decide, to keep going the way we are going. At the other extreme, you can decide to leave the relationship and file for divorce. You don't have to sit there in this bad situation. However, Edith points out, a divorce can be an extreme way of continuing to do nothing. She asks Marina, what do you stand to gain from a divorce? It does give you a piece of paper that says that you're now free to marry someone else. It doesn't resolve the emotional business of the relationship. It just gives you legal permission to repeat the same pattern with someone else. It doesn't make you free. Marina will still be required to heal the wounds she brought with her into the marriage that she will keep carrying for the rest of her life until she deals with them. So a more useful question that Edith asks her is, are you stronger with him or without him? And only you can decide if a relationship depletes or empowers you. But it's not a question you can answer quickly. You can't know the truth about your relationship until you deal with your own wounds, until you bury and leave behind all the things from the past you're still dragging around. You don't have to figure this out in a hurry. It's an answer that will come to you by playing more, by living your life more fully, and by being who you really are, which is a person of strength. So again, the quick takeaways from this that I found really useful were, she talks about change the dance steps. Many couples have a 3-step cycle of conflict: frustration, escalation, and then making up. She says, what are the frustration triggers that keep going unresolved in your relationships that you're just repeating? The second thing she says is take care of your emotional business. What is the message about love that you may have learned as a child that you are carrying into your relationship? Answer the sentence, if you love someone, then. Would you like to be married to you? Really important, and though confronting, what qualities do you think create a comfortable and thriving relationship? Okay, lesson 4. What didn't happen? The prison of unresolved grief. It is a universal experience for life not to turn out how we want or expect. Most of us suffer because we're given something that we don't want, or we want something that we don't have. The inner work required to process this suffering is what Edith calls grief work. She writes, all therapy, and I would argue coaching, is grief work. It's a process of confronting a life where you expect one thing and get another, a life that brings you the unexpected and the unanticipated. Grief is often not about what happened, it's about what didn't happen. And when we deny or minimize our grief or loss, we become prisoner to it. Resolving grief means both to release ourselves from the responsibility of all the things that weren't up to us, and to come to terms with the choices we've made that can't be undone. Edith reminds us that grieving is difficult, but it can also feel good. You can revisit the past, you can embrace it. You're not stuck there. And again, she reminds us you are strong. You can come to terms with what was and what wasn't. And you can concentrate not on what you've lost, but on what is left. The choice to live every moment as a gift and to embrace what is. And then the 5th lesson, there is no forgiveness without rage. People often ask Edith, how can you ever forgive the Nazis? She says she doesn't have the godly power to anoint anyone with forgiveness, to spiritually cleanse others for their wrongs, but she does have the power to free herself, and so do we. Forgiveness isn't something we do for the person who's hurt us. It's something we do for ourselves. So we're no longer victims or prisoners of the past. So we can stop carrying a burden that harbors nothing but pain. Another misconception about forgiveness is that the way we make peace with someone is that we need to make peace with someone who has harmed us, is to say, I'm done with her, I'm not going to deal with her anymore, or him. It just doesn't work that way. It's not about cutting someone out, it's about letting go. As long as you say you can't forgive someone, you're spending energy being against rather than being for yourself and the life you deserve. To forgive isn't giving someone permission to keep hurting you. It's not okay that you were harmed, but it's already done. No one but you can heal that wound. This kind of release doesn't come easily. It's not an overnight process, and lots of things get in the way. The things that get in the way could be a desire for justice or revenge, an apology, or even just an acknowledgement. But life doesn't have to depend on what you get or what you don't get from someone else. Your life is your own, and forgiveness isn't something you give someone else. It's how you release yourself. So the biggest barriers of forgiveness is the necessary reckoning with our rage. Edith says there is no forgiveness without rage, and silent rage is self-destructive. If you're not actively, consciously, intentionally releasing it, you're holding on to it. And that's not going to do you any good. And neither is venting your anger. That's when you blow your top, and it can be cathartic in the moment, but the people around you foot the bill. So how do we feel our rage? Edith says, first we need to legitimize it. You have a right to feel rage. It's a human emotion and you are human. When we can't release anger, we either deny that we were victimized or we deny that we're human. That's basically how perfectionists suffer. Either way, we're denying reality. So anger is a secondary emotion, and it's a defense armor we put up around the primary feelings underneath. We burn through our anger so that we can get to usually what's underneath, which is going to be either fear or grief. Only when we can begin the hardest work of all, which is forgiving ourselves and processing those underlying emotions. So it took Edith many years to work through the anger and the grief to release Mengele, the German SS officer in charge of Auschwitz in 1944, and Hitler. And it took many years to forgive herself for surviving when so many of her loved ones died. The takeaway from this chapter really for me is that we're born innocent and we all have the power to free ourselves from our own mental prisons, no matter what happens to us. Okay, so in conclusion, I'm just mindful of time. There is a Hungarian adage that says you find the darkest shadow beneath the candle. Our darkest and brightest places, our shadows and our flames are intertwined. Life with its inevitable trauma, pain, grief, misery, and death is a gift. A gift we sabotage when we imprison ourselves with fear and resentment and failure and abandonment. The final lesson that Edith offers us is the one that she learned in hell. We can decide what kind of life we want to have. We can either do the inner work required to liberate the untapped potential lying in the shadows, and we can reveal and reclaim who we really are: strong, creative, innocent, and lovable. I want to leave you with her final thought. Honey, may you always choose to give up the prison and to do the work to be free, to find in your suffering your own life lessons, to choose which legacy the world inherits, to hand down the pain or to pass on the gift.
Bloody hell. I have a massive round of applause. Thanks so much for Antoinette. I was utterly captivated by that. Well, I feel like I've had a really difficult therapy session over the last hour. I feel quite exhausted, actually, inspired, and yeah, not quite sure what to do with all that information, and it's just entered my mind and heart. Thanks so much, the three of you, for sharing those thoughts. And I genuinely don't know where to start with questions. There was one that, right, I think the only question that, or explicit question that appeared in the list was right back at the start from Charles. Strange to sort of, feels like Lauren's book was ages ago, but it was only 30 minutes ago or something we ended that. But Charles asks about, I don't know if you can see this in the chat, or so we obviously, you know, meat and dairy is like one of the biggest issues that we are problems that we need to solve in regards to climate change. But I was wondering if Gates sort of made any reference to regenerative agriculture in the book.
Yeah, sorry, I've just seen all the comments. Yeah, he briefly mentioned, but I think the section about food, it was quite small. and he talked a bit more about fertilizer and the massive impact that fertilizer has, and the different solutions there, and also about how its overuse in some developing countries and how cutting back on fertilizer will produce the same yield but save a massive ton of carbon. And there wasn't a huge amount on that area. It was also 2 months ago that I read it. I'm slightly hazy, that section in my mind. But yeah, it was more about fertilizer.
Okay.
Sorry.
Carl says, thank you for answering that. Apologies for being a nerd. Absolutely no apologies required there. You're in good company, Charles. Chris, I wrote down so much stuff for all those 3 talks. We only have sort of 5 minutes to cover 3 extraordinarily big topics, so I'm not quite sure where to start here. I actually wrote, I think I've got like 3 or 4 like mantras that I'll probably take into my like entire life, never mind into my day. But you can heal it if you can feel it. I'm always like a massive fan of anything that rhymes, to be honest. But yeah, that one like resonated massively with me, Antoinette.
I wrote down forgiveness is something we do for ourselves. Like, got my notebook, wrote it down straight away.
Yeah, there's although it's totally unplanned, there are 3 very, seemingly disparate books. There's obviously like a massive amount of connection between at least the last 2. So I don't know, after your wonderful talk, Nathan, whether Antoinette's book resonated in any way with you.
Yeah, massively, because I think it's about self-autonomy. I think you need to decide, you need to decide for yourself like what kind of life you want to live, and take some responsibility for it. And it's difficult, as you said on the very last slide, life's messy and painful, but it's still life and it's still worth living. And I think, just hearing those stories of someone who's been through all of that and is still able to, kind of take a positive aspect to designing the life that they want to live. And that's really what I kind of think I've been going through the last couple of years, is just trying to design purposefully, how I think, how I feel, how I act, and it pays dividends. So yeah, it did definitely resonated.
It's weird that we're not really given the skills to design a life or lead a life with intention, isn't it? Sort of just.
And it goes so quickly. And this is the thing that struck me, is like, you get to like I was thinking, weeks would pass, then months, then quarters, then years. And you look back and you just think, what have I done? How have I been thinking? How have I been moving through these periods? And there's big chunks were just kind of felt like they were going without, them really being considered. So I just wanted to kind of change that and make the most of, like, the years you've got ahead. So, and it's only, as I say, small, some big changes, some small changes, but it's just more interesting than just drifting through,
Yeah, well, there's folks and quite a lot of people that spend a lot of their time designing stuff very intentionally for businesses, for other things, but very rarely apply those skills to our lives, is perhaps the most important thing we can do with those skills. So we need to create a life design workshop.
Yeah,
coming out the back of it. I'm into that. Well, it's 2 minutes to 9. I feel weird about getting on with the rest of my day now. I don't know, I'm going to want to go and meditate or do something healing for the rest of the day, but unfortunately I, like many other folks, have got to go to work. So yeah, we've got a +1 for designing your life workshops. Great. I like that we've a business idea has been born out of this small meeting. But yeah, all I can say is like genuinely thanks so much to Lauren, Nathan and Antoinette for sharing those thoughts. I find them extraordinarly profound. I'll definitely watch them back myself later, so dense with information. Thanks everyone else for joining in the fun. Was it fun? Oh, something. But yeah, everyone, hope you have a great day. Stay safe. I don't know, is everyone okay? I feel, yeah, we're okay, great. And yeah, hopefully catch you. I think we're going to do this again end of July. So yeah, catch you later, and thanks again, folks. Bye.